Delta, United, JetBlue, and American all compete for New York without a clear winner. Over the decades, countless airlines have tried to win the Big Apple without success. Not even legendary airlines like Pan Am could crack the code. Meanwhile, in other key cities, one airline does dominate. Dubai has Emirates. London has British Airways. New York is a little different. And that's by design. You see, in the 1950s, a big decision was made at what is now JFK Airport. The original plan was to construct a simple building with just 55 gates. But airlines back then were keen on having an identity in the city, and they didn't think that this was enough to meet the rising demand for air travel. And they were quite right. So 7 terminals were initially constructed, with airlines like Pan Am, TWA, and American claiming their own space. And today, that same old logic of airlines operating their own terminals still applies. If we go to JFK Airport right now, Delta controls Terminal 4. JetBlue is the only operator out of Terminal 5, while American dominates over at Terminal 8. At LaGuardia, Delta is the king of Terminal C. While if we go over to Newark Airport, yes, it has the same name, Terminal C, United Airlines completely rules over this, and is by far the largest terminal here. Had airports like JFK stuck with their initial plan, assuming it would have been a linear design, then the airports would have looked a lot like Denver, where Southwest and United dominate the scene, or like Atlanta with Delta. Basically, only 1 or 2 airlines handle the vast majority of passengers, and lucrative agreements with airport authorities ensures that this will pretty much always be the case. They control the airport design from the check-in lobbies to even the gates themselves that have the airline logos on them to the baggage claim. Doing the same such thing in New York, on top of the already crazy construction that's going on, would be impossible. The entity that handles the operations of airports like LaGuardia, Newark, and JFK would also not really be on board with this because of the high cost and how it would disrupt millions of passengers. But the airlines wouldn't be on board either. That's because they've poured billions of dollars over the decades into developing the airports, and it won't come so easy for them to just give it up.
We're going to keep investing in New York. This is $1.2 billion.
American made a $400 million investment in the new terminal.
We're going to have our busiest summer ever in New York.
The funny thing is, though, is that even if JFK Airport did go forward with that initial design, and one airline blocked out all the competition, it wouldn't matter so much because LaGuardia and Newark are also equally important. Sure, JFK is the leading international gateway into North America, but the population of New York extends well beyond Queens, going well into New Jersey, where Newark shines. In fact, United actually handled more passengers in 2024 out of Newark Airport than Delta did at JFK. Now, let's say you're a business traveler trying to go from Chicago to Manhattan. Your best bet is LaGuardia, and that's because no other airport is closer to the city center. There's a couple problems though. One, there's only 2 runways, only one of which can be active at a time, and the other is that big planes can't land here since the runways are so short. Also, there is a Lego store in Terminal B. Because the airport is in such a good location, demand far outweighs supply on the runway, meaning there's a problem when it comes to slots. Slots, or takeoff and landing pairs, are essential when it comes to getting access to any airport, but in New York, they aren't very straightforward. That's because the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice use slots as leverage to keep competition alive. Slots determine who gets access to New York at all, and how big any player can get at a given time. The only way to gain slots is for a competitor to give them up, and this pretty much never happens, except in a few rare cases, like when American wanted to get the deal done with US Airways back in 2014. They had to give up 17 desirable slot pairs to smaller players like Southwest, but not even the deal of a century when Delta inherited 132 slot pairs. In 2011, this was not enough to guarantee them a monopoly at the airport. Sure, they have twice the market share, over 40% compared to American, the second largest carrier at this airport. But Delta enjoys a much greater amount of market share at their hub airports like Atlanta, well above 70%, or at Minneapolis, Salt Lake City, or Detroit. About a decade later, Delta didn't even want to give up 8 desirable slot pairs at LaGuardia under WestJet's name, Canada's second largest airline, even though they had approval from the Department of Transportation to get a deal done where this would have completely changed the way we travel between the US and Canada. This really just shows how valuable the slots are. I'd even argue that they are more valuable than the penthouses on Billionaires Row. They seem worthless, right? Do you agree? If we learned anything from Delta, it's that timing is absolutely everything in New York. In 1991, they inherited Pan Am's entire European route network from JFK for $1.7 billion, outbidding 3 other airlines. What a deal! Don't tell anyone I'm drinking coffee so late, by the way. This put all sorts of new dots on the map for Delta, and Delta was able to do this because they were in a much better financial position. The network strategy also worked because Delta had a critical domestic network which Pan Am did not have. Passengers could travel, say, from San Francisco to Milan through New York. Probably James Bond did something like that because we all know how much he loves Italy. United Airlines also tried expanding at JFK more than once, even as recently as 2021, but because of the constraints on the infrastructure and only so many airlines can compete at one airport in New York, they just couldn't win. United didn't even really become relevant in New York until 2012 when they took over the hub operation of Continental. Continental was the largest airline leading up to the merger for many years, and in 2024, United was the biggest airline by passenger numbers in the entire city, but only by a very slim margin, just ahead of Delta. Then there's American Airlines, which unfortunately didn't really have the best timing. They merged with TWA back in 2001, but the economy back then was pretty rough. So American didn't end up moving or expanding their operations into the former famous TWA terminal. This is where a startup airline, JetBlue, shined. They grew in that space, and they also took advantage of the fact that JFK wasn't busy at certain times of the day because most of the focus was on international, so those departures were mostly in the evening and the afternoon. They took advantage of that and they grew aggressively. Even airlines like United and Delta created spin-off airlines in response, which really didn't quite work out, by the way. And a key reason is that the New York market is just too complicated. It's impossible to meet the demands of every traveler. You might have one person who's going on a business trip to Paris, and they might find that the higher fare from Newark Airport is worth it, in case it is higher fare, just hypothetical here, right? Because they live in New Jersey, and they're closer. Or you might have someone who literally lives right next to JFK, but because there's a better fare, let's say at an airport like LaGuardia or Newark, they're trying to go to Florida, they find a 2-hour commute worth it. And also regardless of the fact that the airports in New York are just expensive to operate. The real cost comes with the infrastructure, the fancy lounges, the fact that apparently every aircraft has to have first class, and airlines, to stay competitive, to stay relevant, have to serve exotic destinations. Despite the cost, all airlines are in on it, which makes any airline hard to stand out. So what airlines do instead is they win in their own unique ways. JetBlue is the only airline that has their headquarters in the city. United, of course, dominates over at Newark Airport and serves destinations like Greenland and Cape Town in South Africa. No one else does. Then Delta has a very impressive network over to West Africa. American, they're the only airline that offers service to Tokyo from JFK on a US airline. New airlines are also entering the scene. Frontier is aggressively expanding at JFK. What's guaranteed is that 10 to 20 years from now, New York will not be the same, and no airline will ever truly win. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hop on board right now by subscribing and turning those notifications on. Share this with all of your friends. Fly further.